The number that should concern you most is not the inflation rate. It's not the interest rate. It's not even the deficit. It's the percentage of global trade that is still settled in US dollars. Because that number has been falling quietly, steadily, for longer than most people realize. And the people whose retirement security depends on the dollar holding its position in the world, which is most people watching this, have not been told. Today, I want to show you exactly what is happening to the dollar, not the version that gets discussed in election cycles or on financial news networks with something to sell. The structural version, the version that takes 20 years to become undeniable, and that we are now in 2026 close enough to see clearly. Because here is the thing about slow-moving problems. They do not feel urgent until they are. And by the time they feel urgent, the window to act has already narrowed. I'm Emro, and I'm the founder of Relocate with Revenue on location in Nairobi, Kenya. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further. I am not a financial advisor. I am not here to tell you what to do with your money. What I am is someone who deliberately left a dollar-dependent life, who made the decision to build income assets outside of the US financial system, not because of panic, but because of a pattern recognition. The pattern I saw 5 years ago are more visual now than they were then. And I think you deserve to see them too. This channel exists at the intersection of financial insight and the freedom to act with geo-arbitrage, aka living your life on your terms by relocating to make your money work harder for you. If this is a conversation you are looking for, and if you are still watching, it probably is. So go ahead and subscribe now. I drop new videos weekly, and everyone gets deeper than the last. To understand what is happening to the dollar, you need to understand what made it dominant in the first place. After World War II, the world needed a reserve currency, a stable, trusted medium for international trade and debt. The United States, the only major economy at the time that emerged from the war with its industrial base intact, supplied that reserve currency. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 made the dollar the anchor of the global financial system. Every other currency was pegged to it, and it was backed by gold. But in 1971, President Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. The dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, backed not by physical asset, but by trust. Trust in the U.S. institutions, trust in the U.S. economic management policy, trust in the consistency of U.S. foreign policy. That trust has been the dollar's greatest asset for 50 years. It has also been the thing now being stress tested in ways without modern precedent. Here is what the data shows. In 2001, the US dollar accounted for approximately 73% of global central bank reserves. In 2024, that figure has fallen to around 58%. That is a 15% decline over 2 decades and the longest sustained fall in the dollar reserve dominance since Bretton Woods. Now, 58% is still dominant, and the dollar is not being replaced overnight. But here is the question that the headline numbers obscures. Where is the 15% going? Not to euros, not to the yen. It's going into a basket, Chinese yuan, gold, and a growing category that the economists list as other. The world is not moving to a single new currency. It's moving away from the assumption that one country's currency should hold that position at all. And that shift from dominance to negotiated relevance has consequences for every person whose retirement savings, pension, and purchasing power are denominated in dollars. The dollar is not dying overnight. It is being gradually, deliberately, and structurally sidelined. And the people most exposed are those who have never been told that this was even a possibility. Now let's look at the 3 pressure points causing the de-dollarization in real time. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the countries that have joined since the bloc started, represent 40% of the global GDP buying power. For decades, trade between these countries were largely settled in US dollars because that was the global convention. That agreement is changing. China and Russia now settles the majority of their bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. India has been negotiating rupee-dominated oil purchases. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar arrangement established in the 1970s, has begun accepting yuan for oil sales to China. These are not proposals or experiments. These are transactions that are already happening. And as a result, this is eroding the petrodollar arrangement, which the U.S. negotiated with Saudi Arabia in 1974. That arrangement anchored the structural global demand for dollars, unrelated to the U.S. economic performance. Every country that needed oil, and that's every country, needed to buy dollars to do so. That arrangement created a floor under the dollar for the demand for years. But however, that crack in the foundation is already exposed. The United States national debt is currently edging towards 39 trillion. And by the time you're watching this, it will more than likely have surpassed that number. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the debt to GDP will reach levels not seen since World War II within less than a decade. Interest payments on that debt is now the single largest line item in the federal budget, exceeding defense spending. Why does this matter for the dollar? Because the dollar's value rests on the confidence of the United States as a credible, stable debtor. When foreign governments and central banks hold dollar-denominated treasury bonds, they're making a bet that the U.S. will honor its obligations and that the purchasing power of those dollars will be reasonably preserved. When debt grows faster than economic output, when the interest bill alone begins to crowd out productive spending, that confidence is not destroyed instantly, it erodes. One other point to make. With the onset of Trump's second presidency and his major power plays, i.e. tariffs, the alienation of U.S. allies, threats to confiscate foreign countries, the invasion of foreign countries, and the knee to the necks of several countries, this has also caused a major rift in the confidence of holding US dollars. Now, the third pressure point is the one that accelerated everything else, and it has a specific start date, February 2022. First, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its allies responded by freezing approximately 300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. It was an unprecedented use of the dollar system as a geopolitical weapon. It was also, from a purely strategic standpoint, a demonstration to every other government in the world that dollar-denominated reserves held in Western institutions could be frozen, seized, or made inaccessible by the U.S. foreign policy decisions. The message was received. Within 18 months of that decision, central bank gold purchases globally had surged. Conversations about alternative payment systems accelerated. Countries that had no particular ideological objections to the dollar began asking purely practical questions. If we hold our reserves in dollars and our foreign policy diverges from Washington's, are those reserves safe? These are very logical questions. The dollar's power was always built on the assumption that it sat above geopolitics. The moment that that assumption was tested was the moment that the world saw things for what they really are. That the system was built on not truth and untrust. Now, I want to talk to you about something that is happening right now, this month, as we speak, this month, this year, because the story I've been telling you is not just historical. It has a current chapter, and it's unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz. As you might already know, 20% of the world's petroleum, roughly 20 million barrels every single day, moves through it. It is a passage 21 miles wide at the narrowest point. It sits between Iran on one side and Oman and the UAE on the other. And for 50 years, the United States Navy have been the de facto guarantor of its openness. And as you know, in late February 2026, Trump, with the nudge of "is not real," happened. Then Iran did something that no other nation had done before in modern era. Iran stood on business. In other words, they stuck it to the man. Now, for over 6 weeks and counting, we not only have a closed strait, but also have established a toll system on said strait, causing an economic upheaval unlike anything we've seen in decades. Ships seeking passage through the world's most important oil choke point are required to register their cargo, their ownership, and their crew, and pay a transit fee. And here is the part that matters to this conversation. The toll is accepted in Chinese yuan, not in US dollars. I want to be precise about what this means because there's a lot of noise on social media that overstates it. Iran did not announce that all oil in the world must be now priced in yuan. What they did was establish a wartime transit toll payable outside of the dollar system, routed through the Chinese CIPS payment network, bypassing SWIFT entirely. Now, what does this all mean? I am not here to tell you that the dollar is going to collapse next year. It is not. The dollar still underpins roughly 80 to 90% of the global oil trade. It accounts for 57% of the central bank reserves. It is used for 89% of all foreign exchange transactions globally. The yuan, by comparison, represents less than 4% of SWIFT's international payment and under 2% of global reserve. The infrastructure for petro-yuan system does not exist at scale. But what I am telling you is that the direction of travel is no longer ambiguous. The Hormuz crisis has done what years of BRICS summits and trade agreements could not do. It has created a real-time operating alternative to the dollar for energy transit. Not a proposal, not a pilot program, a working system confirmed by shipping intelligence, acknowledged by China, and supported by the largest buyer of Gulf oil on earth. The Hormuz toll is not the death of the petrodollar. It is the first proof of concept that the world no longer needs it. Russia was the warning. Iran was the demonstration. And the question is not whether the shift is happening. The question is whether you are positioned for a world where a shift has already happened. Now, if you're watching this from the UK, Canada, Australia, or anywhere in the diaspora, I want to speak to you directly for a moment because the dollar's trajectory affects you in ways that are specific to where you are. The pound has lost significant ground against the dollar over the past decade, but that relationship is now shifting in complex ways. For the UK retiree, the most important concern is this: your pension fund is almost certainly heavily invested in US equities and US dollar-denominated bonds. When the dollar weakens structurally, the sterling's value of those holdings adjusts and not in your favor. Canada's dollars tracks the US dollar more closely than almost any other currency pairs in the world, not by design, but by the gravitational pull of the integrated economies. When the US dollar weakens against global currencies, the Canadian dollar often moves with it because markets price the two economies as deeply intertwined. For Canadian retirees, this means that a structural decline in the dollar dominance is not a foreign story. It is, in specific ways, a Canadian story as well. The CPP, Canada's pension plan, global investment, provides some insulation, but the Canadian economy's exposure to the US trade policy, US capital flows, US dollar movements means that there is no clean separation. Australia sits at an interesting position. The Australian dollar is a commodity currency. It strengthens when the global demand for Australian resources is high, and it weakens when it falls. In a world that is diversifying away from the US dollar and with an increased demand for commodities from Australia, this could support the Australian dollars even as the US dollar falls. But the Australian super funds remain heavily exposed to US equities and US dollar assets, and Australia's strategic alignment with the US foreign policies mean that it shares in some degree the reputational and geopolitical exposure that comes with being seen as part of the dollar system. The question for Australian retirees is the same as for everyone else. Where do your assets live, and whose currency are they ultimately denominated in? 3 countries, 3 different relationships with the dollar. The same underlying question: what happens to your wealth when the thing that it is priced in starts to matter less to the world? Now, let me bring this out of the macro and into the specific, because the dollar's global position is not an abstract concern. It translates to your life through 3 channels. Channel 1. Here is the simplest way I can put it. When the dollar weakens, your grocery bill goes up, your medication costs more, your phone, your car, your appliances, everything made overseas and shipped, they all get more expensive. Because a weaker dollar means that you need more of them to buy the same thing from the rest of the world. Now, here is where it gets personal for everyone on a fixed income. The government adjusts your Social Security check every year for inflation. It is called a COLA, the cost of living adjustment. It sounds reassuring, like somebody is watching out for you. But that adjustment is calculated against a formula. And that formula, quite frankly, does not keep up with your actual expenses. So on paper, you got a raise, but in the checkout line, in the pharmacy, at the gas station, you're behind. The numbers went up. The purchasing power went down. That gap between the official numbers says what your life actually cost. Think of it like this. For 50 years, the whole world wanted to invest in America. Foreign governments, foreign companies, foreign pension funds, they poured money into the US stocks and bonds, partly because the returns were good, but partly because owning US assets meant owning dollars. And owning dollars felt like the safest thing in the world. That demand helped to push up your 401k, your IRA, your pension fund. Now ask yourself, what happens if that global appetite starts to shift? If investors around the world start saying, we want some of our money in other places, in other currencies, in other assets. And I might add, like we're seeing now, the money doesn't just disappear. It just moves away from US stocks, away from US bonds. And when the buyers who have been holding up your retirement account starts buying other things instead. Now, do you see the pattern? The retirement savings did not make a bad bet. They made the right bet for the last 50 years. The question sitting in front of you right now is whether it's still the right bet for the next 20 years. This last one is the hardest to see coming because it does not look like a problem until it arrives. Here is the simple version. The United States have been using the dollar as a weapon, freezing countries out of the financial systems, cutting off the access to payments, using economic exclusion as a foreign policy tool. And it has worked until other countries started building their own roads around it. New payment systems, new digital currencies between governments, new ways to buy and sell oil without touching the dollar. These alternatives are clunky right now, imperfect and slow, but they're getting better. And every time they improve, the global demand for dollar quietly disappears. The person sitting entirely inside the US financial system, saving in dollars, income in dollars, retirement in dollars, does not feel this in real time. It does not arrive as a news alert. It arrives as, why does everything cost so much more than it used to? Why is my retirement not stretching the way I planned? Why does the number in my account look fine, but my life feels harder? That is what currency erosion feels like from the inside. Not a crash, not a headline, just a slow, steady narrowing of what your money can actually do. 3 channels, 1 direction. Your purchasing power shrinks. Your retirement account faces headwinds it has never faced before. And the system we have all been used to is being quietly adjusted right under our noses. This is not a reason to panic. It's a reason to have a plan. So what is the plan? I want to pause here for a moment because this is where the information stops being interesting and starts being personal. There's a version of this conversation that stays theoretical, where you understand the mechanics, you nod at the data, you find it compelling, and then you close the tab and you go back to whatever you're doing. Because the alternative to understanding this is deciding what to do about it. And deciding is harder than knowing. I know that moment. I lived it. I sat with the information longer than I needed to. Not because I doubted it, but because acting on it meant admitting that the plan that I had been building, the retirement that I had been promised if I followed the rules, was sitting on a foundation that someone else controlled, and that no amount of discipline, savings, or patience could change that architecture. The moment I stopped asking, how do I protect what I have inside of this system, and started asking, where does that work differently? That was the moment everything shifted. If this video has done what I intended, you are not looking for more information right now. You have enough information. What you're looking for is a plan that is specific to your situation, to your income, your timeline, your assets, and your goals. That is exactly what the strategy session is. It is a one-on-one conversation with me, not a team member, not a chatbot, where we look at where you are and where you want to be, and what a realistic, executable relocation strategy looks like for you specifically, not the general version, yours. It is $300. I said that. It's $300, and I'm not going to apologize for that or bury it at the end of a long sentence. It is $300 because it is a 1-hour focused, personalized, strategic thinking that could meaningfully change the trajectory of your retirement. If that is not worth $300 to you, this is not the right moment for that. And that's fine. The blueprint or the toolkit are in the description as well. You can start there. But if you have been watching this channel, if you've been doing the reading, if you have been running the numbers in your head and arriving at the same conclusion I have been laying out, then the session is the next conversation. The link is in the description below. Now, you might say, boy, she's bold. Or, who does she think she is? I am not apologizing for who I am, nor am I shrinking myself or my worth to fit someone else's idea of where I belong. I made the move. I am living the life I speak about, and I don't have to prove any numbers, as some people might think that they have to do. If this speaks to you, then the least you can and should do is subscribe if you have not already done so. And share this video with someone who is still operating on the assumption that the dollar is permanent. Not as an alarm to them, but to give them the same information that you now have. And if this raised questions that you want to keep thinking about, good. That's the point. The next video in this series is going to give you something else to think about. 5 income streams that have survived every major recession in the last 30 years. The ones that keep paying regardless of what currency they're denominated in. You will want to be here for that one. I'm Emro. I help individuals and families relocate with revenue. Income first, freedom forever. Your plan starts with the links in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.